In this tutorial, we are going to learn about constructors and destructors. So, in the previous tutorial, we have discussed the three types of function, the getter functions, the setter functions, and the manager functions. So, in this tutorial, we are going to study manager functions in detail. So, first of all, let's cover constructors first. So, constructors are the member functions. Let me just define constructors. So, constructor are member functions with same name as its class. So constructors are the functions. They are similar to functions, but the only difference is that these have the name. The name is that of the class. So if the name of the class is student, let's say, so the function will be like this. It will be student and then the function. So one more important thing about constructor is constructors are called or you can say constructors are automatically called. They are automatically called at the time of object creation. So let's just take an example without a constructor, and then we will take the same example and we will use a constructor, and we will see how constructors are needed and how they are used in C++. So we will create the same example. We will create a class student, and since we know that in the class there are three sections, private, public, and protected. So the variables that have no access specifier, they are private by default. So we will create a private member, roll number, and another private member, marks. So in the public section, I will just create a function here, and this function is used to initialize the values of the private section. So this is roll number equals 0 and marks equals to 0.0 because it is a float value. So this function init is used to initialize the private members. So what a programmer will do, a programmer will create an object of this class and will have to invoke this function. Invoke means call this function. So the programmer will call this function to initialize the values to 0. So what we will do here, we will just create the main function, and inside this main function we will create an object of this class like this, student s1. And now if you want to initialize these values, you will have to explicitly make a call, s1 dot initialize or init function. So this init function will just initialize the values of the private members. So this is a type of, you can say, getter function or accessor function. So this function is the first type of function that we have studied. So you can see here that if you want to initialize the values to the private members, you will have to make a call, and this call is also known as explicit invocation. So I will write it explicitly invoke. So this is our normal example where we have used a function in it to initialize the values of the private members. But now what we are going to do is we will now use constructors to initialize values. So we will just create class student again, and the private section will be the same. Then float marks, and then in the public section what we are going to do is we are not going to create this init function, rather we will create a constructor, and we know that the constructor has the same name as of the class. So we will create a constructor like this. So it is similar, it is same as a function, it is just a function, but it has the name as that of the class. So I will just underline it to show you that. Then in this function we will initialize the values. Then marks equals 0.0, and this is the end of this class. And then in the main function, in this main function I will create an object of our class student S1. So what is the need of creating a constructor? Why should we create constructor, and when are constructor needed? So you can see here that if I want to initialize the parameters of the private section, I will have to call it. But in case of constructors, when you create the object, the constructor you will not have to call, you don't need to call it. So there is no need to call this function, it is automatically called at the time of object creation. So whenever, let's suppose the programmer forgets to call the function, so in that case the private variables will remain uninitialized. So if you want to initialize the values, you can leave it to the compiler. So the compiler will just call this constructor at the time of object creation. So whenever you will write this line, the compiler will call this constructor. So basically there are three types of constructors. Number one is the default constructor. Number two is parameterized constructor. And number three is copy constructor. So there are three types of constructors. So let's discuss about the default constructor. So if the constructor is not accepting any arguments or any parameters, it is known as a default constructor. So this is a default constructor. So this is a default constructor. If you want to just give some parameters to it, let's suppose you don't want the value of roll number to be 0, you want it to be something else. So what you will do is you will just write it like this: student S1, and in the circular braces you will write the values. For example, I will write 7, 5.6. So this is an example of a parameterized constructor, and since you are giving two values to this constructor, the compiler will match if this constructor exists in the class or not. So you will have to create a constructor that will accept two arguments. So we will write another constructor, and this time we will have to write two variables here, int a comma int b. And now what you can do is you can assign roll number equals a and marks equals b. So when you will create an object, these two parameters will get copied to a and b, and then your private members will get assigned the value. So this type of constructor is known as parameterized constructor because you are giving parameters in it. So this is an example of a parameterized constructor. So you can see that in this example we have used two constructors in the same program. This is a default constructor and this is a parameterized constructor. And we know that this is similar to function overloading, and since constructors are functions also, so they can also be overloaded. So this is an example of constructor overloading. And in constructor overloading, we can overload our constructor by creating some other constructors that accepts some different parameters. So there are different parameters but the same constructor, and you will have to create the constructor inside the class so that the compiler will check at the time of compilation whether the constructor of this type exists in the program or not. So this is default and parameterized constructor. So this copy constructors is a brief concept. So the next one is we're going to learn is the copy constructor.